Good evening, and welcome back to Drift Through History. There are conquerors who arrive and pass through, leaving a trail of destruction and little else. There are conquerors who take territory and install themselves as rulers, but leave the underlying culture and language and institutions of the place they have taken largely intact. And then, once in a very great while, there is a conquest so complete, so thorough, so transformative in every dimension of the society it falls upon, that the world on the other side of it is simply a different world. Not the old world rearranged, but something genuinely new, carrying within it the seeds of things that the old world could not have produced. Tonight, we are talking about one of those rare events, the Norman Conquest of England in 1066. And the man at the centre of it, William, Duke of Normandy, later called William the Conqueror, is one of those historical figures whose career seems to exceed the normal scale of what a single human life can accomplish. Not because he was a military genius of the first order, though he was, and not because he was a ruthless and effective administrator, though he was that too, but because everything he did had consequences that multiplied across the following centuries into outcomes whose shape we are still living inside today. The English language you're hearing right now contains within it the Norman French that William's followers brought to England in 1066, layered permanently onto the Anglo-Saxon foundation that had been there before. The legal and constitutional traditions of England, and through England of much of the world, carry traces of what William built. The way that power and land and loyalty were organised in medieval Europe was, after 1066, permanently inflected by the specific form that Norman feudalism took in England. One battle, one conquest, one extraordinary and violent and extraordinarily able man, and the world changed. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is genuinely what you come here for. And as always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. Now dim the lights, let the room go soft, find a comfortable position, and let the breath slow down. You have nowhere to be. And let us go back to the middle of the 11th century, to a world that was about to change in ways that nobody inside it could fully see coming. The story of William the Conqueror begins not in England but in Normandy, a region of what is now northern France that takes its name from the Norse settlers who were given it, or who took it, the distinction being somewhat academic in the context of Viking expansion in the early 10th century. The Normans were the Northmen, the descendants of the same Viking populations that had raided and settled England, Ireland, Scotland and Iceland, who had been settled in Normandy since 911, when the Frankish king Charles the Simple, in an arrangement that had the quality of paying protection money with diplomatic cover, granted the Viking leader Rollo a substantial territory along the lower Seine in exchange for homage, conversion to Christianity, and the useful service of a now stationary Viking force defending the Seine Valley against the more mobile Viking bands that continued raiding up the river. The Normans who descended from Rollo's followers had, within a few generations, adapted to the Frankish environment with a thoroughness that is itself one of the more remarkable cases of rapid cultural transformation in the medieval period. They had absorbed the French language, replacing the Old Norse that their ancestors had spoken within roughly 2 or 3 generations. They had absorbed French Christianity, building churches and monasteries of the Romanesque style with a speed and a quality that reflected genuine religious commitment as well as political calculation. They had absorbed the military culture of the Frankish aristocracy, the heavy cavalry, the castle building, the specific feudal arrangements of landholding and military obligation, and they had taken all of these things and pushed them further, developing them into a particular Norman synthesis that was simultaneously French and something more efficient, more organised, more aggressive than the Frankish norm. The Normandy that William was born into was a duchy, a political unit governed by a duke who was technically the vassal of the French king, but who exercised in practice near sovereign authority within his territory. The relationship between the Norman dukes and the French crown was one of nominal subordination and practical independence, and the Norman dukes had been expanding their power and their territory with a consistent energy that the French kings found difficult to check. By the early 11th century, Normandy was one of the most organised and most militarily effective political units in northern France, its duke's authority enforced by a network of castles maintained by a class of mounted knights whose military service was precisely defined by the feudal arrangements that linked each lord to his superior and projected outward by the Norman tendency to see opportunity in instability and to follow that opportunity wherever it led, to southern Italy, where Norman adventurers were in the process of carving out a kingdom from the Byzantine and Muslim and Lombard fragments of that region, and eventually to England, where the specific circumstances of English politics in the 1060s would create the greatest opportunity of all. William himself was born around 1028, the illegitimate son of Duke Robert I of Normandy, and a woman named Herleva, who was the daughter of a tanner or perhaps a leather worker in Falaise. The sources are consistent about her humble origin, and inconsistent about its specific nature. The circumstances of his birth were not concealed and were not shameful in the way that the term illegitimate implies in modern usage. Noble illegitimacy in the 11th century was a common enough condition, and illegitimate sons were regularly recognised by their fathers and provided for within the aristocratic system. But the stigma was real enough that William's enemies used it against him throughout his career, calling him the bastard in the specific sense that was intended to diminish and to wound, and the evidence of his character suggests that the wound landed and that it shaped the specific quality of his ambition, the ferocity of his determination to be taken seriously, to be acknowledged, to be not merely powerful but undeniably powerful in ways that no one could dismiss. Robert I died in 1035 on his return from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, leaving the duchy to the 7-year-old William in a document of succession that had the force of Duke Robert's personal authority and the weakness of a minor's inability to enforce it. What followed was one of the most dangerous childhoods in the history of medieval nobility, and the accounts of it, preserved in Norman chronicles written a generation or two after the events, describe a decade of endemic violence in which the Norman aristocracy, freed from the firm hand of an adult duke, pursued its own feuds and ambitions with a viciousness that several times came close to killing the child who was nominally their lord. William's guardians died violently, several of them in circumstances that suggested assassination rather than accident. The boy himself was moved from place to place by loyal servants who slept across his doorway at night to protect him. The Norman duchy fractured into competing factions, each controlled by a branch of the ducal family or by the most powerful Norman lords, each pursuing its own interests at the expense of any coherent ducal authority. William survived his childhood through a combination of luck and the loyalty of a small group of supporters, but the specific episodes of that childhood deserve more than summary, because they illuminate the specific texture of the danger he navigated and the specific character that emerged from navigating it. The guardians who died included Osborne of Crepon, one of the most important of the early supporters, killed in the boy William's own chamber by a member of the Montgomery family during an internal noble quarrel, the murder committed according to the tradition, while Osborne slept across the doorway he had positioned himself to guard. A scene of domestic violence and personal loyalty killed in the same moment. Another guardian, Count Alan of Brittany, who had been assigned the boy's care by the King of France, died suddenly in circumstances the chronicles do not fully explain. A third, Ralph de Gassé, apparently survived but was of limited usefulness. The men who had committed themselves to the young duke's survival found themselves in a world where that commitment could cost them everything, and the ones who maintained it despite the cost were demonstrating exactly the quality of loyalty that William would value and reward throughout his subsequent career. The turning point of William's minority came at the Battle of Valles Dunes in 1047, when he was approximately 19 years old. A coalition of Norman barons led by Guy of Burgundy, who was William's cousin and had his own dynastic claim to the duchy, rose in rebellion against the young duke's authority in a revolt that threatened to end his rule entirely. William appealed to his overlord King Henry I of France, who supported him. The French king had his own interest in preventing any single Norman lord from dominating the duchy and destabilising the border, and the combined Franco-Norman force met the rebels at Valles Dunes near Caen. The battle was a Norman victory, and its result was the collapse of the most serious challenge to William's authority during the minority period. Valles Dunes was not the end of William's military challenges. The following decade was a period of almost constant warfare, against the Count of Maine to the south, against the King of France himself when Henry I's policy shifted from supporting to opposing the increasingly powerful Norman Duke, against the rebellious barons of his own duchy who continued to test the limits of their nominal submission. At the Battle of Mortimer in 1054 and the Battle of Varaville in 1057, William defeated French royal invasions of Normandy with a tactical skill and a use of terrain that demonstrated military abilities well beyond what his youth would have suggested. The victory at Varaville in particular, where William caught the French army divided by a tidal crossing of the Dives River and destroyed the rear half before it could reunite with the advance, showed the opportunistic tactical intelligence that would characterise his greatest successes. The specific quality that the chronicles of this period attribute to William is not simply courage, though he had courage in abundance. It is the combination of courage with self-control, the ability to wait for the right moment, to resist the temptation to act before conditions were favourable, and then to move with decisive speed once the moment arrived. This combination, patience followed by explosion, is visible in everything from the careful preparation of the English invasion to the specific tactical situations of Mortimer and Varaville to the management of the conquest's aftermath. It is a rare combination in any military commander, and in a man whose childhood had given him every reason for the kind of reactive aggression that chronically threatened children sometimes develop. Its presence in William suggests something about the specific quality of the intelligence that the dangerous years had shaped. William survived his childhood through a combination of luck and the loyalty of a small group of supporters whose commitment to him was perhaps explained by exactly the qualities that his enemies used against him. The bastard son of a humble mother, precisely because he was not the product of any of the great Norman baronial families, was a lord whose advancement of his own position was not automatically a threat to any particular faction. The Norman lords who supported William through his minority were not, for the most part, acting out of idealism. They were acting out of the calculation that a weak, young, illegitimate duke was a useful instrument for their own purposes. They underestimated him. It was an underestimation that would prove consequential. The England that William would eventually conquer was, in 1028, when he was born and throughout the decades of his development as a ruler, a kingdom of considerable sophistication and considerable internal tension. To understand what he was taking and why it mattered, you need to understand what England actually was in the middle of the 11th century, which is to say, you need to understand that it was one of the most administratively advanced kingdoms in Western Europe, with a system of taxation, law and royal governance that was more developed than anything in France or the German lands, or anywhere in the Western Christian world, except possibly the revived Holy Roman Empire. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom that Harold Godwinson was defending at Hastings in October 1066 had its roots in the centuries of English history that followed the withdrawal of Roman authority in the early 5th century and the subsequent settlement of the island by the various Germanic peoples, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, who gave the new order its character. The process had been violent and disruptive, replacing the Romano-British population of the lowlands with new settlers and new languages in ways that archaeological and linguistic evidence reflects, and that later medieval historians dramatized into a coherent narrative of conquest and transformation. By the 7th and 8th centuries, the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England had developed into stable political entities with their own legal traditions, their own ecclesiastical networks, and their own cultural achievements. Most spectacularly, the monasteries that produced in the works of Bede and Alcuin and their contemporaries some of the finest scholarship in the early medieval Western world. The 9th century brought the Vikings, and the impact of Viking raiding and eventual Viking settlement transformed the political landscape of Anglo-Saxon England in ways that the subsequent history of 1066 makes difficult to separate from the Norman story. The Danish Great Heathen Army that invaded England in 865 and spent the following decades carving up the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms produced the specific crisis that Alfred of Wessex, Alfred the Great, transformed into the foundation of English national identity. Alfred's defence of Wessex against the Danes, his eventual settlement with the Danish leader Guthrum, the division of England into the Danelaw in the north and east under Danish control, and the English kingdoms in the south and west, and Alfred's systematic programme of cultural and administrative renewal in his own kingdom. The schools, the translations, the reformed military organisation, the Boer system of defended towns that gave England a network of military strongpoints, produced in the late 9th century a Wessex-centred English kingdom that would, under Alfred's successors, expand northward to unite the whole of England under a single crown for the first time. This unified English kingdom, fully achieved under Athelstan in the early 10th century, and maintained with varying degrees of effectiveness under the subsequent West Saxon dynasty, was the most sophisticated political entity in the British Isles, and arguably in Northern Europe. The English system of taxation, the geld, a land tax assessed on the basis of a unit called the hide, that represented a notional area of agricultural land, was the most reliable and most systematically administered fiscal system in the Western world outside of Byzantium. The English administrative system, the division of the country into shires governed by royal officers called sheriffs, the network of royal courts where the king's law was applied, the writ system by which royal commands were issued in writing to local officials, was an apparatus of governance more systematic and more penetrating than anything the Norman dukes had in their own territory. The English coinage system, with its regular cycles of minting and its royal control of the money supply, was the most sophisticated monetary system in the north. England was, in short, a kingdom worth having not merely for its territory and its agricultural wealth, which was substantial, but for the administrative machinery that extracted and organised that wealth with an efficiency that the medieval world rarely managed. The specific crisis of 1066 was not, however, primarily a constitutional or administrative crisis. It was a succession crisis, and understanding it requires going back to one of the more complicated family arrangements in early medieval European history. The Danish king Canute, in the more familiar spelling, had conquered England in 1016 and ruled it until his death in 1035, creating for a brief period a North Sea empire that included England, Denmark and Norway. Cnut was an effective king of England who worked largely within the existing Anglo-Saxon administrative framework rather than replacing it, and his reign was not the catastrophe that might have been expected from a foreign conquest. But his death without a clear succession arrangement produced the usual chaos, and after a period of disputed rule, the West Saxon dynasty was restored in the person of Edward the Confessor, who ruled England from 1042 to 1066, was deeply pious, was apparently childless, and created through his childlessness the succession crisis that 1066 was the violent resolution of. Edward the Confessor had spent much of his early life in Normandy, in exile during Knut's reign, and his Norman connections were genuine and personal. He brought Norman advisors, Norman clergy, and Norman cultural influences to England throughout his reign, generating hostility from the English aristocracy, especially from the most powerful of the English earls, Godwin of Wessex and his formidable family. The Godwin family dominated English political life in the 1040s and 1050s in ways that periodically reduced the king to something approaching a figurehead, and the conflict between Edward's Norman preferences and the Godwin family's English nationalism produced a political tension that ran through the entire second half of the reign. The question of who would succeed the childless Edward was the question that this tension eventually converged on, and the answer to that question was the cause of the War of 1066. William of Normandy's claim to the English throne was based on several foundations, not all of them equally solid. The most dynastic was the relationship between his great-aunt Emma of Normandy and the English royal house. Emma had been married successively to the English King Ethelred the Unready and to the Danish King Knut, and through her the Norman ducal house had a connection to the English royal family that was real but distant. More immediately, William claimed that Edward the Confessor had promised him the English succession during Edward's reign, that at some point in the 1050s the King of England had sent an embassy to Normandy, acknowledging William as his designated heir. This claim cannot be definitively verified from the surviving evidence, but it was not implausible. Edward's Norman connections were real. William had already established himself as one of the most capable rulers in northern France, and the childless king may genuinely have considered designating a Norman successor as a way of managing the succession question. The most dramatic support for William's claim was the oath that Harold Godwinson himself had sworn. Harold, the most powerful of the English earls and the son of the late Godwin, had visited Normandy in the early 1060s. The precise circumstances of his visit remain disputed, whether he went voluntarily on a diplomatic mission, or was shipwrecked and fell into William's hands as a prisoner. And while he was there, he had sworn on sacred relics to support William's claim to the English throne. The oath was, by the standards of the 11th century, a binding commitment, and William's subsequent claim that Harold had perjured himself by accepting the English crown after Edward's death was the moral and legal foundation of the Norman campaign. The Bayeux Tapestry, the extraordinary embroidered narrative of the conquest that was almost certainly produced in England within a generation of the events it depicts, shows Harold swearing the oath with his hands on reliquaries, and makes its visual argument for the moral weight of his subsequent perjury with considerable skill. Harold Godwinson's claim to the English throne was, in practical terms, the strongest of all. He was the most powerful nobleman in England. He had been effectively governing the kingdom alongside the increasingly infirm Edward, and on Edward's deathbed, according to the English sources, which are naturally partisan in his favour, the king commended the kingdom to his care. The Witan, the council of English nobles and clergy who had the traditional authority to recognise a new king, chose Harold immediately following Edward's death in January 1066, and Harold was crowned in Westminster Abbey the same day. He was, from the English perspective, the legitimate King of England, chosen by the proper constitutional process and endorsed by the ecclesiastical establishment. From William's perspective, he was a perjurer who had stolen a throne he had promised to support another man's claim to, and the moral case for military intervention was correspondingly clear. But there was a third claimant in 1066 whose existence is sometimes overshadowed by the more famous confrontation between Harold and William, and who adds a dimension to the story that the two-sided narrative misses. Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, claimed the English throne on the basis of an alleged agreement between earlier Scandinavian rulers, and he invaded northern England in September 1066 with a substantial Norwegian fleet. Harald Hardrada was one of the great warriors of the Viking Age, a man who had served in the Varangian Guard of Byzantium and had fought across the Mediterranean and the North Atlantic with a ferocity and a military effectiveness that made him one of the most formidable military figures of his generation. His invasion of the north forced Harold Godwinson to march his army from London to Yorkshire at a pace that the chronicles describe with a kind of brevity that indicates genuine astonishment, covering the distance of nearly 200 miles in about 4 days. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge on September the 25th, 1066, Harold's army, fresh from its extraordinary march, fell on the Norwegian forces with a surprise and a violence that destroyed them entirely. Harold Hardrada was killed. The Norwegian fleet, which had sailed south with an enormous force, departed with the survivors in a fraction of the ships that had brought them. The chronicles record that the original fleet had required hundreds of ships and the survivors needed fewer than 30. It was one of the most complete military victories in English history, and it accomplished in a single afternoon the elimination of the Norwegian threat that had been the third element of 1066's three-way succession crisis. Harold Godwinson had demonstrated in one battle that he was a commander of the First Order. 3 days later, on September the 28th, William's fleet landed on the Sussex coast. The crossing of the Norman fleet from the mouth of the Dives River to the English coast had been delayed for weeks by contrary winds, a delay that the Norman sources interpret as providential. God withholding the favourable wind until the moment was right, and that the military historian interprets as a period during which Harold's army, assembled on the south coast in expectation of exactly this invasion, had been forced to disperse because it could not be maintained indefinitely in the field. William had assembled an invasion force of remarkable size and complexity. The estimates of its strength vary widely in the sources, but the fleet that crossed the Channel numbered in the hundreds of ships, carrying several thousand knights with their horses, thousands of infantry, engineers and supporting troops, and the material for a sustained military campaign. This was not a raid. It was a conquest, planned and organised with the thoroughness of a man who had been thinking about England for years. The Norman force landed at Pevensey on the Sussex coast, and immediately began the systematic ravaging of the surrounding countryside that was both a practical necessity, the army had to eat, and a deliberate military strategy. The devastation of Harold's own family estates in the region was intended to provoke the English king into an immediate response, to draw him south before he could fully rest his army after Stamford Bridge or assemble the additional forces that time would have allowed him to gather. The strategy worked, and whether it worked because Harold's temperament made him unable to endure the ravaging of his territory, or because his political position as the new king required him to be seen defending his kingdom, or because he genuinely misjudged the military situation, remains a subject of historical debate. Harold marched south from London. His army had been supplemented by some reinforcements gathered during the brief period between Stamford Bridge and the march south, but the core of it was still the force that had just fought and marched hard in the north, and the question of whether it was fully recovered from the physical demands of that campaign when it met the Normans at Hastings is one that the subsequent outcome makes poignant but cannot definitively resolve. He took up a position on a ridge at a place then called Senlac, about 7 miles north of Hastings on October 13th, 1066, with his army deployed in a shield wall along the crest of the ridge. The Battle of Hastings, fought on October 14th, 1066, lasted most of a day, and the specific tactical problem it presented to both sides illustrates why 1066 was not simply a matter of Norman military superiority overwhelming Anglo-Saxon backwardness. It was a genuine contest between two effective and different military systems whose outcome was not determined before the battle began. The Norman army that assembled at Hastings was organised around 3 arms: the heavy cavalry that was the shock weapon of the Norman military system, the infantry who supported and screened the cavalry and formed the attacking force for positions that the cavalry could not easily reach, and the archers whose missile fire was intended to disrupt and weaken the enemy formation before the cavalry closed. The coordination of these three arms, the archers softening the enemy line, the infantry pressing forward to keep the enemy occupied, the cavalry striking at the moment when the enemy line showed weakness, was the tactical system that the Normans had developed through decades of warfare in France and Italy, and it was a system of considerable sophistication for its period. The English army that Harold had deployed on the Senlac Ridge was, at its best, an equally sophisticated military instrument of a different kind. The housecarls, the professional warriors who served the king and the great earls on a permanent basis, armed with the Danish great axe that was one of the most formidable hand weapons in the medieval arsenal, trained and experienced in the discipline of the shield wall, were the equal of any infantry in Europe. The shield wall they formed, locked shields overlapping, axes ready over the top of the wall, was a formation that had defeated Viking armies and that had, just days earlier, destroyed Harald Hardrada's Norwegian force at Stamford Bridge. On good ground, properly formed, the Anglo-Saxon shield wall was nearly impregnable to frontal cavalry assault. The horses would not charge into a solid wall of shields and weapons, and the Norman knights could not easily use their primary weapon, the momentum of the mounted charge, against a formation that held its ground. The specific narrative of what happened at Hastings is worth working through carefully, because the popular summary, Normans won, English lost, the end, misses the genuine drama and the specific decisions that determined the outcome. The battle opened with the Norman archers firing into the English formation on the ridge, an opening that produced limited results because the English were positioned above them, and the arrows were largely deflected by the shield wall or fell short. The Norman infantry advanced up the slope and engaged the English line and was repelled. The English axes and the discipline of the shield wall made the slope a killing ground for attackers. The cavalry charges that followed were also repelled, the horses refusing to charge into the solid line of shields, the Norman knights unable to get the decisive breakthrough that their horses' momentum was supposed to deliver. At some point in the middle of the day, a portion of the Norman left, the Breton contingent fighting under the command of William's Breton allies, broke and fled down the hill. The specific reasons for this are not clear. Genuine panic, the result of heavy casualties, or a deliberate feint ordered by William who recognised that the retreat might draw English troops off the ridge. The Norman sources, writing in the knowledge of the eventual victory, describe it as a deliberate feint. The balance of historical opinion is that it began as a genuine retreat that William either ordered or recognised and turned to his advantage. What happened next is clear. A portion of the English force, the less disciplined 3rd Infantry on the right of the English line, or possibly men pursuing what they thought was a fleeing enemy, came down the slope in pursuit of the retreating Normans, broke the integrity of the shield wall, and were caught in the open by Norman cavalry who turned on them. The breach in the English line, once opened, was exploited. There followed several more hours of fighting, the English formation contracting as it suffered casualties, and its flanks were progressively weakened, William reportedly having 3 horses killed under him in the fighting, the Norman attacks continuing until the late afternoon when Harold was killed and the English resistance finally collapsed. The battle was not a foregone conclusion at any point until the final hour or two. It was a genuinely hard-fought engagement whose outcome was determined by a combination of English tactical error, Norman tactical flexibility, and the specific death of Harold that removed the centre of English command at the critical moment. The Battle of Hastings, fought on October 14th, 1066, lasted most of a day, which was unusual for medieval battles, which typically ended much more quickly when one side broke, or the initial shock of contact destroyed the cohesion of one of the formations. The English shield wall, the traditional Anglo-Saxon defensive formation, in which dismounted warriors lock their shields together to present an unbroken front, was, on its chosen ground, enormously difficult to break by frontal assault. The Norman cavalry charges that drove up the slope toward the English position were repelled repeatedly through the morning and into the afternoon. The Norman knights, unable to penetrate the wall of shields and axes, the English housecarls, the professional warriors who formed the backbone of Harold's force, fighting with a disciplined ferocity that showed why the English military system, at its best, was as effective as anything in the Western world. The tactical crisis of the battle came when a portion of the Norman force, it may have been a genuine retreat or it may have been a feigned one, and the Norman sources naturally claim it was deliberate, while the possibility that it began as a genuine retreat that William subsequently turned to his advantage is also plausible, fell back from the English line, and a portion of the English army, apparently the less disciplined third levies on the flanks, broke formation to pursue them. The pursuing English troops were caught in the open by Norman cavalry and destroyed. The breach in the English line, once opened, allowed the Norman cavalry and infantry to exploit the gap, and the integrity of the shield wall was broken. Harold Godwinson died at Hastings. The manner of his death has been argued about since the 11th century. The famous image in the Bayeux tapestry of a figure pulling an arrow from his eye, or falling, struck by an arrow, the image being ambiguous, perhaps the most debated two-dimensional representation in English art history. Whether he was killed by an arrow, by Norman knights who cut him down after the line broke, or by some combination of both, he died on the field, and with his death the English resistance collapsed. The Norman cavalry pursued the fleeing English into the dusk, and the Battle of Hastings was over. The aftermath of Hastings was not an immediate English submission. The English nobles, after a period of disorganisation in which various alternatives were briefly considered, eventually approached William at London with the offer of the crown, and William was crowned King of England on Christmas Day 1066 at Westminster Abbey, in a ceremony whose disturbing interruption, the Norman guards outside, mistaking the shout of acclamation inside for a riot, set fire to the surrounding buildings, and the ceremony continued inside amid the smell of smoke, while panicked crowds fled in the streets. Was perhaps an omen, or perhaps simply the chaotic result of nervous soldiers and an unfamiliar ritual. What followed over the next 5 years was not the peaceful consolidation of a completed conquest, and the specific stories of the resistance that William had to suppress illuminate both the genuine popular depth of the English opposition to the Norman takeover and the specific brutality with which William responded to it. The English resistance was not simply the uncoordinated reaction of a shocked population. It had leaders, it had geographical bases, and it had the potential to succeed. At several points in the first 5 years after Hastings, the Norman conquest was genuinely at risk. The most famous of the English resistance leaders was Hereward, known to later tradition as Hereward the Wake, the watchful or the wakeful, an epithet that later legend applied to him but that the contemporary sources do not use. Hereward was a Lincolnshire thane who had been outlawed before the conquest, and who returned after 1066 to find his family's lands in Norman hands. The details of his career are buried under layers of later legendary elaboration that make it difficult to separate the historical Hereward from the heroic figure that later English tradition made of him, but the core is solid. He led a resistance based in the fenlands of East Anglia, using the islands in the marshes as defensible bases, conducting raids on Norman positions and Norman settlers with considerable effectiveness. The great monastery of Ely on its island in the fens became the centre of the resistance in 1071, when the Danish fleet that was supporting the English rebels anchored at the Isle of Ely, and the combination of English resistance fighters and Danish allies made the position genuinely formidable. William's suppression of the Ely resistance was accomplished through engineering as much as military force. He built a causeway across the marshes to reach the island, denying the defenders the geographical advantage that the fens had provided, and then took the monastery by storm. The Danish fleet was bought off with tribute, as Danish fleets had been bought off throughout the history of English-Danish relations, and the English resistance on the island collapsed. Hereward himself escaped, and here the historical record gives way to legend. The later tradition has him living as an outlaw in the Greenwood, continuing his resistance, eventually making peace with William on honourable terms, and dying peacefully in possession of his lands. The reality is likely more prosaic. He probably fled, possibly to Flanders or Scotland, and disappeared from the historical record. But the legend he became tells you something about the need of the conquered English population for a hero who had not entirely submitted, and Hereward served that need in a way that the documentary record's silence about his fate paradoxically supported. Edgar Atheling was the more dynastic focus of the English resistance, the young great-nephew of Edward the Confessor, who had been the obvious choice for the English throne in the immediate aftermath of Hastings if the English political community had been in a position to make that choice effectively. Edgar was probably about 14 or 15 at the time of the conquest, too young to command the kind of immediate personal authority that the crisis required, and the Witans' decision to approach William rather than crown Edgar reflected a pragmatic assessment of the military reality rather than any enthusiasm for the Norman claimant. Edgar went to Scotland, where he was sheltered by the Scottish King Malcolm III, who was married to Edgar's sister Margaret, a woman of remarkable personal quality who would eventually be canonised as St. Margaret of Scotland. Edgar was involved in multiple subsequent attempts to reclaim England with Scottish and Danish support, attempts that failed consistently, but that occupied William's attention and military resources throughout the 1070s. The specific complexity of William's Scottish relationship illuminates one of the recurring problems of his reign. Scotland under Malcolm III was a kingdom that could not easily be ignored, but could not easily be conquered. A northern power whose support for the English resistance leadership was a persistent irritant, and whose raids into the north of England were a recurring threat to the stability of the border region. William's punitive campaign into Scotland in 1072, which reached as far north as the Firth of Tay, and extracted from Malcolm a formal submission, and the expulsion of Edgar Atheling from Scottish territory, was a demonstration of the reach of Norman military power, but it did not resolve the underlying tensions of the Scottish relationship, which would continue to generate crises long after William's reign. What followed over the next 5 years was not the peaceful consolidation of a completed conquest, but a prolonged and brutal struggle to make real the victory that Hastings had begun. The English did not accept the Norman Conquest, with the resignation that the military result might have suggested. There were revolts across the country, in the north, in the southwest, in East Anglia, supported by Welsh and Scottish allies, supplied in some cases by Danish fleets that came and went with the opportunism that characterised Scandinavian intervention in English affairs throughout the period. Each revolt was suppressed with a thoroughness that William applied to military challenges throughout his career, and the suppression was not gentle. The harrying of the north in the winter of 1069 to 1070 was the most devastating single episode of the conquest, and it was an event that sits uncomfortably in any account of William's reign that is inclined to give him credit for administrative effectiveness without also accounting for what administrative effectiveness sometimes required. The northern counties of England, Yorkshire above all but extending into Durham and beyond, had been the centre of sustained revolt, supported by a Danish fleet that had entered the Humber estuary. William's response was systematic destruction, the burning of crops, the slaughtering of livestock, the destruction of agricultural equipment, the salting of fields. The intention was not merely to punish rebellion, but to eliminate the productive capacity that sustained rebellion, to create conditions in which the North could not support either a rebel force or the population that fed it. The result was famine. Contemporary sources describe bodies lying unburied along the roads, people reduced to eating horses and dogs, and worse, a depopulation of the northern counties so severe that the Domesday Book, compiled 2 decades later, still records large areas of Yorkshire and surrounding counties as wastus. Waste, the administrative term for land out of cultivation and uninhabited. Some historians have used the language of genocide for the harrying of the north, and while the use of the term for 11th century events raises definitional questions, the scale of the deliberate destruction and its human cost are not in dispute. William the Conqueror was capable of this. He was also capable of the administrative creativity, the political intelligence, and the institutional innovation that made the English kingdom he built one of the most effective governmental organisations in the medieval West. The combination is not comfortable, but it is the combination that the evidence requires us to see. The transformation of England that William presided over across the 20 years of his reign was thoroughgoing in ways that touch almost every aspect of the society he governed. The most immediately visible was the redistribution of land. The Norman Conquest was, among other things, one of the largest and most rapid transfers of property in the history of the British Isles. The English aristocracy that had held the land of England under Harold and his predecessors was, within a few years of the conquest, almost entirely dispossessed. Their lands were distributed among William's Norman followers, the men who had fought at Hastings and the subsequent campaigns, according to a feudal logic that tied land tenure to military service in ways that the more diffuse arrangements of Anglo-Saxon England had not. The scale of this redistribution is documented in remarkable detail in the Domesday Book, the great survey that William commissioned in 1085 and 1086, which recorded the ownership, the agricultural productivity, and the value of every significant piece of land in England with a thoroughness that has no parallel in any other European state of the period, and that remains one of the most extraordinary documents of medieval governance ever produced. The Domesday Book shows a country in which the landholding class had been almost entirely replaced. The handful of English landholders who survived the conquest and the redistribution as significant property owners is vanishingly small compared to the thousands of Normans, Bretons, Flemings, and other followers of William who appear in the survey as the new lords of England. The great earls and thegns who had controlled the regions of England under the Anglo-Saxon kings had been replaced, in almost every case, by men who spoke a different language, worshipped in a different style, built their castles in a different manner, and owed their positions to William's personal gift rather than to inherited Anglo-Saxon custom. Before we assess what William built, it is worth understanding in more specific detail how he fought, because the Norman military system was not merely a set of weapons and tactics, but an integrated approach to warfare, logistics, and political control that represented one of the most effective military systems the medieval world had yet produced, and that William applied with a consistency and a sophistication that his contemporaries recognised and feared. The castle was the foundational instrument of Norman military power, and its significance in the conquest of England cannot be overstated. A Norman castle of the motte and bailey type, the form that the Normans built first and fastest in England, before the more substantial stone keeps that followed, consisted of a mound of earth, the motte, with a wooden tower on top surrounded by a palisade, connected by a bridge or a causeway to a larger enclosed area at the base, the bailey, where the garrison lived and the horses were stabled. This structure could be built in days from locally available materials by a workforce that the Norman lord could compel, and it provided an immediate military strongpoint that the surrounding population could not take without siege equipment and organised military planning that most rural English communities did not possess. The Normans built these fortifications immediately on arrival, and everywhere they went. The first thing that William did after landing at Pevensey was build a castle. The first thing he did after the victory at Hastings was build more castles. The first thing every Norman baron did on taking possession of his new English lands was identify the strategic position in his territory and begin building. The effect on the English population was immediate and lasting. The castle was not merely a defensive structure. It was an instrument of domination, a physical statement that the Norman lord controlled the surrounding territory, and that resistance to that control would require an investment of military effort that most potential resistors could not make. The population that farmed the land in the shadow of a Norman castle was a population under constant awareness of who was in charge and what the cost of defiance would be. The psychological dimension of the castle, the constant visibility of the lord's power, the daily reminder of conquest, was as important as its military function, and the Norman barons who covered England in castles in the years after 1066 understood both dimensions equally well. The castles were one of the most immediately visible expressions of the Norman takeover. The Normans built castles. The Anglo-Saxons had not in the Norman sense. The burhs that Alfred had established were town defences rather than private fortifications, and the private castle of the Norman type, the fortified residence of a lord that served both as a military strongpoint and as an expression of personal power over the surrounding countryside, was almost unknown in pre-conquest England. Within years of the conquest, castles were appearing across the English landscape with a speed that reflected both the military necessity of controlling a hostile population and the Norman cultural habit of expressing lordship through stone fortification. The Tower of London, whose White Tower was begun by William in the early years of the conquest, was the most prominent of these, but it was representative of hundreds of castles built across England in the 2 decades after 1066, at county towns, at strategic river crossings, at the centres of the new Norman baronial estates. The language of governance changed. Anglo-Saxon England had conducted its royal administration in Old English. The writs, the charters, the legal documents of the English state were written in the vernacular, at a time when most European kingdoms used Latin for such purposes, a development that reflected the sophistication and the self-confidence of the Anglo-Saxon administrative tradition. After the conquest, English gradually disappeared from the language of official documentation, replaced first by Latin and later, in some contexts, by Anglo-Norman French, the specific form of French that the Norman settlers brought to England and that evolved in the English environment into something distinct from continental French. The ordinary English population continued to speak Old English, which evolved over the following centuries into Middle English, but the language of power, of the court, of the law, of the church at its highest levels was French. The linguistic division between the Norman ruling class and the English population they governed produced the specific mixture of Germanic and Romance vocabulary that defines the English language today. The reason that English has so many synonym pairs where one word comes from Old English and one from French, that we cook beef and pork, from French bœuf and pork, but raise cattle and pigs, Old English, that we speak of kingly and royal, freedom and liberty, ask and inquire. The Norman Conquest is embedded in the English vocabulary with a permanence that no subsequent historical event has erased. The Church in England was transformed as thoroughly as the lay aristocracy, and the specific character of the ecclesiastical transformation is worth examining because it represents one of the most significant dimensions of the Norman Conquest's long-term consequences. Consequences that extended through the relationship between England and the papacy, through the development of English theology and monastic life, and ultimately through the specific Protestant Reformation that the English Church would undergo 5 centuries later. The pre-conquest English Church was not unreformed. It had its own traditions of learning and piety that were genuine and respected across the Christian world. The great monasteries of Canterbury, Winchester, Ely, and elsewhere had been centres of intellectual and spiritual life for centuries, producing scholarship, illuminated manuscripts, and ecclesiastical music of the first quality. The English Church was also, however, deeply embedded in the specific arrangements of Anglo-Saxon kingship, with bishops and abbots who owed their appointments to royal favour and who functioned as part of the administrative machinery of the English state, rather than as primarily ecclesiastical figures. This integration of church and state, while practically convenient, was exactly what the Gregorian reform movement was trying to end. Lanfranc of Bec was, by any measure, one of the finest minds of the 11th century. Born in Pavia in northern Italy, trained in law and then theology, he had established at the Abbey of Bec in Normandy a school that attracted students from across Europe and that produced several of the most significant thinkers of the age, including Lanfranc's own student and eventual successor, Anselm, whose ontological proof of the existence of God became one of the most discussed philosophical arguments in the history of Western thought. Lanfranc himself was a logician of considerable precision, a theologian of careful learning, and an ecclesiastical administrator of ruthless efficiency. And William's appointment of him as Archbishop of Canterbury was perhaps the most consequential of all the appointments William made in England. Under Lanfranc's direction, the English Church underwent a transformation in organisational structure, in disciplinary standards, and in its relationship to the continental Church. The councils that Lanfranc convened in the years after his appointment addressed the specific abuses that reformers had identified as the targets of the Gregorian programme: clerical marriage, the buying and selling of ecclesiastical offices, the appointment of clergy by lay lords without proper ecclesiastical procedure. The monasteries were brought under closer Benedictine discipline. The hierarchy of the Church was reorganised, with Canterbury's primacy over the entire British Church, a question disputed between Canterbury and York for decades, established through a series of legal arguments that Lanfranc prosecuted with the precision of the lawyer he had been before becoming a monk. The new Norman bishops and abbots who replaced the English holders of these positions brought with them not only different personal backgrounds and different theological education, but different architectural ambitions. The great cathedrals and abbey churches that the Normans built in England across the decades after the conquest were expressions of the Norman Romanesque style. Massive structures of stone, with round arches and thick pillars, with elaborate carved decoration and with a scale that was intended to express, in architectural terms, the authority of the church that inhabited them. Durham Cathedral, begun in 1093, was perhaps the most ambitious of these projects, its ribbed vault an innovation of genuine architectural significance, and its sheer scale. The nave nearly 70 feet wide, the towers rising above the Durham Gorge to a height visible for miles, a statement about Norman ecclesiastical ambition that was also a statement about Norman power in the north. Winchester, Canterbury, Ely, Lincoln, Norwich, Gloucester. The great Norman cathedrals that rose across England in the half-century after the conquest were the physical expression of a transformed church, and many of them still stand, their Norman stonework visible beneath the Gothic additions of later centuries as permanent evidence of what the conquest produced. The church in England was transformed as thoroughly as the lay aristocracy. William brought to England a programme of ecclesiastical reform that was informed by the Gregorian reform movement, then sweeping the Western Church, the campaign for clerical celibacy, for the separation of church and state appointments, for the elevation of papal authority, and the strengthening of monastic discipline that Pope Gregory VII was promoting, with a combination of theological conviction and political ruthlessness. William appointed as Archbishop of Canterbury Lanfranc of Bec, one of the finest ecclesiastical minds of the 11th century, who had been his adviser and the head of the greatest school in Normandy, and who proceeded to reorganise the English Church on Norman and reforming lines with the efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he wanted to accomplish and had the royal support to accomplish it. The English bishops who had held their sees under Harold and his predecessors were systematically replaced, over the years following the conquest, with Normans and other continental clergymen. New monastic houses were founded on the Norman model. The organisation of the English Church, its relationship to the papacy, its internal hierarchy and discipline, were all reformed in ways that brought England into alignment with the continental patterns that William and Lanfranc considered proper. The legal changes were more subtle, but ultimately perhaps the most consequential of all. William maintained the existing Anglo-Saxon law for the English population, the principle that Englishmen would be governed by English law, and Normans by Norman law was a practical necessity in a society where the two populations were initially quite separate, and it persisted for generations. But the imposition of Norman overlordship on the existing legal structure had effects that compounded over time, as the interaction between Anglo-Saxon common law traditions and Norman feudal law produced the specific English legal synthesis that would eventually become, through a long and complicated process of development, the common law tradition that England bequeathed to much of the world. The Domesday Book itself was a legal instrument as much as an administrative one. It was created to establish the ownership of land with a certainty that could be appealed to in subsequent legal disputes, and the process of its creation, in which royal commissioners travelled the country, hearing testimony from local juries about what each manor had been worth and who had owned it before and after the conquest, established procedural precedents that would influence English legal practice for centuries. William as a person is difficult to recover from the sources, which are mostly either Norman apologists or English complainers, and the truth of his character requires some navigation between these partisan accounts. The physical description that survives: he was tall for his time, heavy-set, perhaps running to fat in his later years, with a harsh voice that the Norman sources call commanding and that his enemies presumably describe differently, gives a general impression without the specific detail that would make the portrait vivid. What the sources do agree on, across their disagreements about almost everything else, is the quality of his will. He was a man of extraordinary personal force, capable of inspiring a loyalty in those who followed him that went beyond the ordinary calculations of feudal service, and capable of generating in his enemies a dread that was specific and individual, rather than merely the generalized fear that any powerful opponent produces. His childhood had given him something. The boy who had survived the murderous Norman nobility of the 1030s and 1040s, who had been moved from safe house to safe house by servants sleeping across his door, who had watched his guardians die, and had understood from an early age that his survival was a contingent thing that required constant management. That boy had grown into a man for whom the exercise of power was not merely a pleasure or a right, but a necessity, a daily affirmation of the survival that his enemies had tried to prevent. The bastard duke who became the Conqueror of England was not performing a role. He was completing a project that had begun with the accident of his birth and the specific cruelties of his childhood, and the completion of it had a quality of personal intensity that the sources register even when they do not fully explain. His relationships were few and apparently genuine in their way. His marriage to Matilda of Flanders, which he pursued against the initial opposition of the papacy on grounds of consanguinity, produced a partnership that the evidence suggests was genuinely close. Matilda served as regent of Normandy during William's absences in England, exercised real political authority, and appears in the sources as a figure of independent significance, rather than merely as the Duke's wife. They had at least 4 sons and 5 daughters, and the dynastic complications of what happened to them after William's death were considerable. His relationship to violence was instrumental rather than sadistic. He was capable of great destruction when he decided it was necessary, the harrying of the North being the most extreme example. But the evidence does not suggest a man who enjoyed cruelty for its own sake. He was capable of mercy when mercy served a political purpose, and capable of severity when severity served one, and the calculation between the two was always present. His piety was genuine, and expressed itself in the Norman fashion of the period, which combined sincere devotion with the political uses of religious patronage in ways that the modern mind finds difficult to hold together, but that the 11th century found entirely natural. He built churches and monasteries with a generosity that reflected both personal conviction and the social obligation of a lord who required the prayers of the religious communities he patronized. The most famous of his religious foundations was Battle Abbey, built on the site of Hastings as an act of penance for the bloodshed of the battle, and as a permanent memorial to the moment that had made everything else possible, its high altar placed at the spot where Harold was said to have fallen. Battle Abbey still exists, its ruined walls visible in the East Sussex landscape, a 1,000-year-old monument to the specific spot where English history turned. The last years of William's reign were troubled by exactly the kinds of problems that the scale and the complexity of what he had built made inevitable. The Norman barons who'd been his partners in conquest were not, once they had their English estates, entirely content with the position of loyal subordinates. Some of the most dangerous baronial threats came from within his own family. His eldest son, Robert Curthose, who'd been promised Normandy and who believed his father was withholding his inheritance unjustly, revolted against him and was defeated in a battle at which, according to the chronicles, William and Robert actually fought each other personally in the confusion of a night skirmish before Robert recognised his father and withdrew. The episode produced a temporary reconciliation, but not a permanent resolution of the underlying tension, and Robert's relationship with William remained contentious until the end. The specific strategic problem that dominated the later years of the reign was the threat from France, from the French crown, which had maintained its nominal suzerainty over Normandy throughout the period of English conquest, and which was now watching with considerable alarm as the Duke of Normandy had added England to his possessions and become the most powerful single ruler in the northwestern part of the world. Philip I of France was not a capable ruler. The sources are not kind to him, and the unkindness appears to be earned. But he was capable of recognising a threat when it had grown large enough, and the threat of a powerful Normandy-England combination dominated the Franco-Norman relationship through the 1070s and 1080s. The specific casus belli of the campaign that killed William was the French king's encouragement of resistance in the Vexin, a disputed border region between Normandy and the French royal domain, and William's retaliatory raid on the town of Mantes in the summer of 1087. Mantes burned. While riding through the burning ruins, William's horse stumbled on debris and threw him against the iron pommel of the saddle. Or perhaps the horse stumbled into an ash-covered pit that concealed still burning embers. The sources are not precise, and he received an abdominal injury that his 59-year-old body could not recover from. He was carried to Rouen and then to the priory of Saint-Gervais outside the city, and he died there on September the 9th, 1087, after several weeks of increasing infirmity, during which he apparently had time for extended reflection on his life and his sins, and during which he is reported to have received the rites of the Church and expressed something approaching contrition for the violence that his career had contained. The deathbed scene that the sources describe has a quality of narrative completeness that makes the historian cautious. The dying king surveying his conquests, distributing his kingdom, reflecting on the cost of what he had accomplished. But some elements of it are attested across multiple sources and appear to reflect genuine events. He divided his inheritance. Normandy went to Robert Curthose, England to his second surviving son William Rufus. His third son Henry received £5,000 of silver. The arrangements were precarious from the start, and the subsequent history of the relationship between Normandy and England under William's sons would demonstrate exactly how precarious they were. The account that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the English historical record, written by monks who had lived through the conquest, and who expressed in their writing a perspective that was neither simply hostile nor simply accommodating to the Normans, gives of William at his death is one of the most balanced assessments in any contemporary source. He was wise, the chronicle says, and a great king. He surpassed in honour and strength all who had lived before him in England. He was stern beyond measure. The harsh tone that the chronicle adopts reflects the experience of a conquered people, but its acknowledgement of William's greatness is not reluctant. He was what he was, and what he was had changed their world in ways they understood, even if they did not entirely welcome. The Domesday Book, which William commissioned in 1085, and which the commissioners completed the survey for in 1086, deserves particular attention, because it is in some ways the most characteristic single expression of what William's England was, and because it is a document of such extraordinary ambition and such extraordinary achievement that it commands attention on those grounds alone. But to understand what made it remarkable, you first need to understand what it was trying to do and what the information it gathered actually reveals when you read it carefully. The survey was called in the contemporary Latin descriptio, a description, a survey, an inventory. The name Domesday was applied to it by the English population almost immediately, and the name tells you everything about how it was received. Domesday in the Middle English spelling, meant the day of judgment, the final accounting from which there was no appeal. The English called the survey Domesday because the information it gathered, once recorded in the King's Book, was final. You could not dispute your entry. You could not claim that your manor was worth less than the survey said it was worth, or that you held less land than it recorded you holding. The King's commissioners had taken sworn testimony from juries of local men, had recorded it in the King's rolls, and the record had the authority of royal judgment behind it. It was the last word, hence Domesday. The specific information the survey gathered was organised around a series of key questions. What is this manor called? Who held it in the time of King Edward? Who holds it now? How many hides does it contain? How many ploughs are there on the domain? And how many ploughs belonging to the villeins? How many villeins are there? And how many cotters? How many slaves? How much meadow? How much woodland? How many mills and fisheries? What is it worth now, and what was it worth in King Edward's time? All this to be given 3 times, as it was in the time of King Edward, as it was when King William gave it, as it is now. The threefold temporal structure of the survey is itself historically significant. It established a legal baseline, the state of things in the time of King Edward the Confessor, who was now the legitimate standard against which all changes were to be measured, and compared it with the present, identifying both the changes that had occurred with the conquest and the obligations that attached to each piece of land. The survey was not merely descriptive, it was legal. Its purpose was to establish, with the finality that sworn testimony before royal commissioners could provide, who owned what and on what terms, to create a documentary foundation for the feudal relationships that now organised English society, a record that could be appealed to in disputes about tenure and obligation for generations. The specific entries in Domesday tell stories that the administrative language barely contains. The frequent notation of waste, wastam est, it is waste. In the Yorkshire and North Midland sections is the terse bureaucratic residue of the harrying of the North, the systematic destruction of the winter of 1069 to 1070, a manor that was worth 40 shillings in the time of Edward, and is now waste, is a manor whose inhabitants are dead or fled, and whose fields are abandoned. The cumulative effect of hundreds of such entries across the northern pages of Domesday is a record of deliberate destruction on an enormous scale, rendered in the dry language of administrative accounting with a chilling completeness. The specific entries concerning the English survivors of the conquest are equally telling. Here and there in the Domesday record an English name appears among the list of Norman holders, a thegn who had managed to retain some portion of his former lands, usually as a sub-tenant under a Norman lord rather than as a freeholder in his own right, a woman who had preserved a small estate, a minor English landowner whose property was too small to attract Norman attention. These surviving English names are the exception that proves the rule of the wholesale dispossession, and they stand out in the Norman-dominated record with the specificity of individuals who found a way to survive what most of their class did not, because it is in some ways the most characteristic single expression of what William's England was, and because it is a document of such extraordinary ambition and such extraordinary achievement that it commands attention on those grounds alone. The book, it is actually 2 volumes, usually called Great Domesday and Little Domesday, the latter covering East Anglia in more detail and apparently never subjected to the final compilation that the other circuits received, was produced in response to William's wish to know the condition of his kingdom. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the commissioners going through every county, asking who held each manor, how many hides it contained, what it was worth in the time of Edward the Confessor, what it was worth now, and whether more could be extracted from it. The process of gathering this information was itself a remarkable governmental operation. The commissioners travelled in circuits, holding sessions at the county towns where representatives of each hundred, the administrative subdivision of the county, appeared before them and answered questions on oath. The information gathered was then collated and written up in the form that survives, organised by landholder rather than by geography, so that a reader could see at a glance all the manors held by a given baron anywhere in England. The result was a document of the royal government's knowledge of its own kingdom, with no parallel anywhere in the medieval world until well into the following century. A systematic record of who owned what it was worth, and what obligations attached to it, compiled within a few months of the commission being given and covering the entire country, with the exception of the far north. The information in Domesday is not perfectly accurate. The commissioners relied on testimony, some of which was mistaken or deliberately misleading, and the format imposed on the data was not always the most natural one for the information it was trying to capture, but it is accurate enough to support modern historical analysis across a wide range of questions, and it has been used by economic historians, legal historians, administrative historians, and archaeologists studying the settlement patterns of 11th century England for well over a century of systematic scholarly attention. It tells us the distribution of wealth across the country, the size of the aristocratic states and their relative value, the relationship between different land use patterns and agricultural productivity, the specific changes wrought by the Norman Conquest in the distribution of property across counties and regions. It is, in short, one of the most valuable historical documents in existence, and it was produced by a government of remarkable sophistication from information gathered by an administrative apparatus that was, even by the standards of the medieval world, extraordinarily effective. The language question that the Domesday Book raises is characteristic of the whole post-conquest period. The survey was conducted in both Latin and Old English. The commissioners' returns were written in a mixture of languages, reflecting the bilingual reality of the post-conquest administration. But the final compilation was in Latin, which was the language of record in the Norman administrative tradition. The Old English that the Anglo-Saxon bureaucracy had used for its administrative documents was being displaced, not because it was less effective as a medium of administration. It was at least as effective as Latin for these purposes, and had the advantage of being immediately comprehensible to the local officials who had to implement its provisions. But because the Norman ruling class that now controlled the government used Latin and French, and the administrative culture followed the ruling class. The specifically Norman character of what William built in England is worth dwelling on, and one way to understand it is to see what the Normans were doing everywhere else simultaneously, because the same Norman energy that took England in 1066 was also rewriting the map of southern Italy and Sicily in the same decade. and the comparison illuminates what was distinctively Norman about both ventures. While William was organising his English invasion, Norman knights in southern Italy had been carving out a kingdom from the fragmented political landscape of the Mezzogiorno, the former Byzantine territories of Apulia and Calabria, the various Lombard principalities of the Italian south, and eventually the Muslim-controlled island of Sicily, with the same combination of military aggression, political opportunism, and administrative sophistication that characterised the English conquest. Roger de Hauteville and his brother Robert Guiscard were the dominant figures of this southern Norman expansion, and the kingdom they created, the Kingdom of Sicily, which would eventually become one of the most culturally sophisticated states of the 12th century, a meeting point of Arabic, Byzantine and Latin cultures under Norman rule, was in many respects a parallel achievement to what William was accomplishing in England. The Norman capacity for rapid cultural assimilation, which had allowed them to absorb French culture in Normandy within a few generations of Rollo's settlement, was on display in Sicily as well, where the Norman rulers patronised Arabic scholars, maintained Byzantine court traditions, and produced hybrid cultural achievements, the mosaics of the Palatine Chapel in Palermo, combining Byzantine theological iconography with Islamic architectural forms under Norman royal patronage that had no parallel anywhere in the medieval world. The Normans were not, in short, cultural destroyers who simply imposed their own traditions on the societies they conquered. They were absorbers and synthesizers who took what was useful from wherever they found it and combined it with their own traditions in ways that produced something new. In England, the synthesis was between Anglo-Saxon institutional sophistication and Norman military and organisational energy, and it produced, as we have noted, a state of remarkable effectiveness. In Sicily, the synthesis was between three separate and highly developed cultural traditions, and it produced a different kind of achievement, cultural brilliance rather than administrative efficiency, though the Norman Sicilian state had its administrative strengths too. What both achievements shared was the specifically Norman quality that Robert de Hauteville and William of Normandy both exemplified, the ability to recognise what the place they had conquered was good at, and to build on it rather than replacing it entirely, a pragmatic intelligence that was perhaps the most distinctively Norman quality of all. The specifically Norman character of what William built in England is worth dwelling on, because the Normans were not simply French and not simply Norse. They were a specific synthesis, and what they brought to England was the particular product of that synthesis. The heavy cavalry and castle building of the French military tradition, combined with the organisational energy and the specific appetite for governance that the Norman dukes had developed over the preceding century in their management of their own duchy. The specific forms of feudal tenure that the Norman conquest imposed on England, the precise definition of military service owed in exchange for land, the system of sub-infeudation by which the great barons divided their estates among their own followers who in turn owed them military service, the legal principle that all land was ultimately held from the king, were not invented by William, but were applied to England with a systematic completeness that the more gradual evolution of feudal arrangements in France had never achieved. The result was a kingdom more tightly organised, in the specific feudal sense, than any other in Western Christendom. William's insistence on the personal oath of allegiance from all significant landholders directly to himself, the Oath of Salisbury in 1086, at which the landholders of England swore fealty to William personally, regardless of who their immediate lords were, was a constitutional innovation of the first importance. It established the principle that feudal loyalty in England was ultimately owed to the king, not to the intermediate lords, that even the vassal of a baron was the king's man in a sense that transcended his immediate obligation to his immediate lord. This principle, the ultimate primacy of royal authority in the feudal chain, distinguished English feudalism from French feudalism in ways that had long-term constitutional consequences, contributing to the development of a specifically English form of royal government that would eventually produce, through the tortuous processes of medieval constitutional development, the constitutional monarchy that began to emerge in the 13th century. The Norman Conquest also transformed England's position in the wider world. Anglo-Saxon England had been oriented primarily towards Scandinavia, toward the North Sea world of Denmark, Norway and Sweden, that had been its primary external reference point since the Viking Age, and that had produced the dynastic connections, the commercial relationships, and the cultural influences that shaped English life in the 9th and 10th centuries. After 1066, England's primary orientation was toward France, toward Normandy first, then through the dynastic and political complications of the following decades, toward Anjou and Aquitaine and the broader French world. England became part of a cross-channel political and cultural zone whose complications would dominate English foreign policy for centuries, generating the various attempts to expand or defend English territorial holdings in France that consumed so much of the energy and so many of the resources of the English monarchy, from the Norman period through the 100 Years' War. The specific combination of Anglo-Saxon institutional sophistication and Norman organisational energy that the conquest produced was, in the assessment of most historians who have studied it closely, more effective than either element alone would have been. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom had an administrative apparatus of remarkable quality, but was vulnerable to the succession crises and internal baronial conflicts that a more purely personal form of royal authority was susceptible to. The Norman system of feudal military obligation and castle building provided a degree of social control and military effectiveness that the Anglo-Saxon system lacked. The combination created a kingdom that was, by the standards of the 12th century, the most effectively governed state in Western Christendom. A state whose fiscal, legal and administrative systems would be built upon and elaborated by William's successors into the specific form of English government that, through a long process of development, produced the institutions that eventually came to influence constitutions and legal systems across much of the world. The question of what William the Conqueror means, what his historical significance is, assessed honestly and in full, is one that requires holding two things simultaneously that the conventional narrative often treats as incompatible. He was a conqueror who imposed a foreign ruling class on a subject population, with consequences that the subject population experienced as catastrophic. The dispossession of the English aristocracy, the linguistic marginalisation of the English language and the English cultural tradition at the higher social levels, the physical violence of the conquest and its brutal suppression of revolts, the deliberate destruction of the North, these are real, and they were experienced by real people whose lives were diminished or ended by them. The language of the Domesday Book's record of wasted land in Yorkshire is an administrative language, dry and bureaucratic, but it describes a human catastrophe of the first order. He was also a builder, and what he built has proven more durable than the destruction he accomplished. The administrative and legal foundations he laid, the specific form of English royal governance he created, the ecclesiastical organisation he reformed, the cultural synthesis his conquest set in motion. These things outlasted him by centuries and eventually shaped institutions that extended far beyond England's shores. The English common law, whose specific character owes much to the interaction of Anglo-Saxon legal tradition and Norman feudal practice in the period after 1066, became one of the most influential legal systems in world history through the mechanism of British imperial expansion. The constitutional tradition that produced Magna Carta and eventually parliamentary government, which owes something to the specific form of Anglo-Norman governance that William established, became the template for constitutional arrangements that spread across much of the world. These outcomes were not inevitable, and they were not what William intended. He was not, so far as any evidence suggests, thinking about the constitutional future of the world when he commissioned the Domesday Book or enforced the Oath of Salisbury. He was thinking about his own kingdom, his own dynasty, his own power. But the structures he built were robust enough to survive him and flexible enough to be adapted to purposes he could not have imagined. The specific figure of the conqueror himself sits in the English imagination in a complicated place. He's the last successful invader of England, which gives him a kind of permanence in the national story. Everything that came after, every subsequent attempt to invade, failed, which means that what William did in 1066 stands as the fixed point from which the subsequent history begins. The England that exists today is, in a direct and traceable sense, a product of 1066, of the specific decisions that William made and the specific form of conquest that he accomplished. This is not sentimentality or national mythology. It is a statement about the traceable continuity of institutions and languages and legal traditions from that specific point in 1066 to the present. The bones of Domesday are in the land registry. The bones of the feudal tenure system are in English property law. The bones of the Norman French that William's followers spoke are in the English vocabulary that every English speaker uses every day without knowing it. He was a man of his time in all the ways that phrase implies, capable of great violence, indifferent to the suffering of those his ambitions required him to destroy, genuinely pious in the form that 11th century piety took, loyal to those who were loyal to him, and merciless to those who were not. He was also something that transcends the clichés of his time, a figure of such extraordinary organisational and military capacity, of such ferocious and sustained ambition, that the medieval world he lived in produced very few who approached him, and none who exceeded him in the specific combination of qualities that the work of conquest and the work of building something lasting afterward required. The bastard Duke of Normandy, who crossed the Channel with his fleet in September 1066 and defeated the last English king at Hastings, had spent his life preparing for exactly that moment, and when it came he was ready for it in a way that the world had given him every reason not to be. The physical traces of what William built are distributed across the landscape of England with a density that makes it impossible to move through the country without encountering them. The Tower of London is perhaps the most immediately recognisable. The White Tower, the great stone keep that William began in the early years of the conquest, rising above the Thames on its slightly elevated platform, is one of the oldest continuously inhabited buildings in Britain, and one of the most architecturally significant. Windsor Castle, another of William's constructions, is still the official weekend residence of the British royal family, making it perhaps the longest continuously used royal residence in the Western world, a function interrupted by nothing in nearly 1,000 years. Battle Abbey in East Sussex, built on the Hastings field as William's penance and memorial, preserves in its partial ruins the outline of a religious house that stood for centuries before the dissolution. Durham Cathedral, built in the decades after the conquest in the Norman Romanesque style that William's ecclesiastical programme promoted, is one of the finest examples of that architectural tradition anywhere in Europe. Its massive rounded arches and thick pillars expressing in stone the same qualities of weight and solidity, and uncomplicated confidence that Norman governance brought to the country it had conquered. The Bayeux tapestry, which is not actually a tapestry but an embroidery on linen cloth about 70 metres long and 50 centimetres wide, deserves more than a single paragraph, because it is one of the most extraordinary documentary artefacts of the medieval period, and because reading it carefully reveals things about the Norman Conquest that the written chronicles do not. The tapestry tells the story of the conquest from its origins, Harold's visit to Normandy and his oath to William, through to the Battle of Hastings itself, though the final section is incomplete, either damaged or simply never finished, and the narrative breaks off before the aftermath of the battle. It was made, almost certainly, in the 1070s or 1080s, within a generation of the events it depicts, by artists who either witnessed those events directly or worked from the accounts of those who did. The quality of the observations, the specific details of ship construction and military equipment, the gestures and postures of the figures, the specific moments chosen to represent broader events, suggests an artist or artists who were paying attention to the world they lived in with an unusual and documentary quality of notice. The tapestry is organised in a continuous frieze, like a modern comic strip, with scenes flowing into each other across the length of the linen. Above and below the main narrative band run borders filled with animals, both real and fantastical, interspersed with scenes from Aesop's fables and with images that sometimes comment ironically on the action in the main band above or below them. The border animals are frequently in conversation with the main narrative, hunting scenes that mirror the military action, fables about predators and prey that comment on the political relationships depicted above. Reading the borders alongside the main narrative reveals a pictorial intelligence that is operating at more than one level simultaneously, telling the official story in the main band and making more ambiguous observations in the margins. The specific scenes that the tapestry renders most vividly are those of military action and maritime operation. The Norman fleet crossing the Channel, the ships drawn with a knowledge of Viking ship construction that reflects the Norman heritage, the horses visible in the lower parts of the hulls, the sails billowing in the favourable wind, is one of the great documentary images of medieval maritime technology. The embarkation and landing sequences show the logistics of the operation with a specificity that no chronicle provides. The horses being loaded and unloaded, the supplies carried ashore, the castle being built at Hastings immediately after the landing. The battle itself is rendered in a sequence of images that have been endlessly analysed for what they reveal about medieval military practice. The cavalry charging, the arrows flying, the shield wall engaging, the moment of Harold's death rendered in the most debated image in English art history. The tapestry's producers were English. The technical vocabulary of the embroidery style, the specific details of the English army's equipment, the quality of craft that has been attributed to Canterbury needlewomen, but its commission was Norman, most likely by Odo of Bayeux, William's half-brother and one of the most powerful figures in post-conquest England. The combination of Norman commission and English execution produces a document that simultaneously tells the Norman story and reveals, in its specific choices of what to include and how to render it, the perspective of English artists who had their own understanding of the events they were depicting. The tapestry is one of the rare surviving artifacts of the immediate post-conquest period that carries within it both voices. Tells the story of the conquest in visual narrative with a vividness and a density of detail that makes it one of the most remarkable documentary artifacts of the medieval period. It was probably commissioned by William's half-brother Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, who appears in it as a prominent figure, and it was probably made in England, possibly in Canterbury, by English needlewomen working under Norman direction. The technical quality of the embroidery is consistent with English craftsmanship of the period, and the narrative it tells, while broadly favourable to the Norman cause, contains details and perspectives that suggest the involvement of English artists who had their own views about what they were depicting. It is now in a specially designed museum in Bayeux in Normandy, protected from light and humidity in a darkened room, where several 100,000 people visit it each year to see the Norman version of the story that changed England, rendered in coloured wool on linen by craftswomen who may have lived through the events it depicts. The Domesday Book itself is in the National Archives at Kew, in the London suburb that houses the British government's documentary heritage, in a building designed specifically to preserve documents of exactly this fragility and this irreplaceability. The 2 volumes are not on permanent public display. The act of opening them for viewing would risk damage, but they are regularly consulted by scholars and facsimiles and digital editions make their contents accessible to researchers across the world. The survey that William commissioned in the last years of his reign, completed in 1086, has been continuously useful to scholars, lawyers, and historians in ways that its creators could not have imagined, and the information it contains continues to illuminate aspects of 11th century England that no other source preserves. The language argument is the most pervasive legacy and the hardest to see precisely because it is everywhere. The English language that you are hearing right now, the specific vocabulary, the grammatical structures, the way that words cluster around concepts, carries within it the Norman French of 1066 in forms so thoroughly integrated into the language that separating them from the Anglo-Saxon base requires specific etymological attention. Approximately 30% of the vocabulary of modern English derives from French, most of it entering through the Norman Conquest and its aftermath. The legal vocabulary is almost entirely French or Latin in origin. Court, judge, jury, attorney, property, felony, evidence. Because the Norman legal system that William imposed used French as its operating language, and the terms of the law that developed in that tradition are the terms that English law still uses. The political vocabulary carries the same marks: parliament, government, state, nation, crown, royal, sovereign. French words that entered English through the Norman Channel and that give the political tradition of the English-speaking world a specifically French undertone that most English speakers never consciously register. The night is settling in now, and the long story of William the Conqueror has reached its end, or the end of the part that can be contained in a single sitting, because the consequences of 1066 have been unfolding for nearly 1,000 years and are still, in various ways, present in the world tonight. The last invasion of England, the last English king killed on the field defending his crown, the transformation of a sophisticated Anglo-Saxon kingdom into the specific form of Norman-inflected English governance that would eventually, through a long and complicated process, become the model for constitutional arrangements across much of the world. The language permanently altered, layered with French vocabulary in ways that no subsequent event has undone or could undo. The landscape permanently marked, with castles and cathedrals and the recorded evidence of the Domesday survey that can still tell you who owned a specific piece of English land in 1086. William himself died in Rouen, of an injury sustained in a burning town in Normandy at 59 years old, having spent most of his adult life in the saddle and the rest of it in the administration of a kingdom he had won by force and built by intelligence. He was buried at Saint-Étienne, the great abbey church he had built in Caen in Normandy, and the story of his burial has a quality of posthumous indignity that would have appalled the man who valued dignity above almost everything else. His body, after lying in state, was found not to fit easily into the stone sarcophagus that had been prepared for it. It was bloated from the abdominal injury, or from the heat of the summer, or from whatever combination of causes the medieval body was subject to, and the process of forcing it into the tomb was accompanied by a terrible smell, and then the rupture of the abdomen entirely, filling the church with an odour that sent the assembled clergy and nobility fleeing. It is the kind of detail that the chroniclers who disliked him preserve with a certain satisfaction, and that those who admired him perhaps regret preserving, but that history requires preserving because it is true. The bones that remained in the tomb were scattered at the Reformation, when the French Huguenots damaged the tomb and scattered its contents. A single thigh bone was later recovered and reinterred, and a modern marker in the church of Saint-Étienne in Caen marks the spot where what remains of William the Conqueror lies, a single bone in a stone box, under a plain slab, in the church he built, in the city that was his capital, in the country that was his beginning. England has the castles and the Domesday Book, and the language and the constitutional tradition. Normandy has the bone. Let that settle around you now. The White Tower is dark over the Thames tonight, as it has been on every night for nearly 1,000 years. The Domesday Book is in its climate-controlled room at Kew. The words still legible, the survey still complete, the record of a kingdom in the first years after everything changed. The field at Hastings is quiet, somewhere in East Sussex, in the darkness, with the abbey ruins at the point where Harold fell and the October grass growing over the place where the shield wall finally broke. It has been close to 1,000 years. The world that William made is still the world we are living in, more than any other single figure of the medieval period, because what he did in those 5 years between 1066 and 1071 was not merely conquest, but transformation. Not merely destruction, but construction. And the thing he built has proven, for better and for worse, remarkably durable. Rest easy.